As many of you have figured out by now, I'm not from around here. It's kind of a giveaway when I start talking. I actually come from the Isle of Lewis, and that meant that if I wanted to go anywhere, such as the mainland, you had to go on a 3-hour crossing, a journey by boat. And I've got some terrible memories of that. That was, of course, back in the day when we had ferries that ran. It's not so much the case now. But there was nothing worse. I remember being really young, and there was genuinely nothing more terrifying and sickening than being in the middle of a squall in the Minch on a bad day. And it does a strange thing. Now, there's lots of ways that you can experience that kind of dread and fear, but there's something about being on, as the Psalm said, really high seas that makes you just quite aware of how small you are and how little control. Because when we're on dry land, we can kind of control most things, and we have a degree of control of most things in our lives, especially now. There's so many conveniences. But in the middle of a raging sea with no land, you don't have that, and it gives you that awareness. And I think that's why Jesus chose this to perform this miracle. He chose this exact circumstance very deliberately because he had a point to make. So when we've been thinking about the miracles, one of the main things we've been trying to reinforce is they're not just these kind of magic tricks that he does to show how amazing he is. He's actually trying to point to the fact that he's healing the problem between God and humanity, that he's healing the world. And he does everything very deliberately. We thought about the fact that he's showing that he's come to take away shame, that he's showing that he's a healer, and that he's taking away the powers of evil in the world. That was last week. And this week we're going to see, well, firstly, how he's got power over nature, which God alone has. Secondly, I think we're going to see he's got power over death, which is something that still affects all of us today. And after we've seen those things, those are kind of, I think, the teaching bits in this passage. I'd like us to try and see how that then applies to our lives and where we find ourselves. Well, firstly, he's got power over nature. The miracle stories, the tendency has been, I've said this before, is to maybe see them as a bit like a Tolkien story, you know, The Lord of the Rings. There's a ring of truth to it, but it might be a myth. There is writing like that in the Bible, but I don't think that's what's going on in the miracle stories, because there seems to be too many historical details. The fact that he goes in a real place in time and space, the Sea of Galilee, which is about 7 miles wide at the widest point. If you were just creating some sort of myth about a great power, you wouldn't need to add those kinds of details about where it took place and what Jesus had been up to. He said, let's go to the other side. He'd been teaching, and then he wants to go to the other side and continue his ministry. The Gospels are mostly, from what we can figure out in history, eyewitness accounts. And that's going to become important as we think about what this is claiming. Because if it is an eyewitness account, and this in any way remotely happened, it does have implications for all of us, if Jesus actually did this. They get into the lake and they set out. And so the implication is they set, now they were all fishermen, okay, the disciples. So they know the seas, they know the water, they're kind of old hands at this. It's not likely they would have set out if there was a squall. They would have said, no, we'll put it off till tomorrow, you know. The sailing's cancelled. But they set out. So it seems that in this passage, in this journey of 7 miles, which would have taken them a fair while, the squall comes down, and that's the problem. Now, the Sea of Galilee, we tend to think of it as a lake. Some of you, I know, have been to the Holy Land, so you know what I'm talking about. But it's a lake surrounded by mountains. But the sea itself is in a depression about 700 feet below sea level. So what ends up happening is that there's a mixture of cold and warm air that comes down, mixes over the sea from the mountains, and can create an almighty squall very quickly. I mean, how many of you have ever been on a ship and the weather can change like that? You don't see it coming and then you're in trouble. That's how people end up needing to get rescued every summer around our coasts. So that's what happens, and they get caught in the middle of this. The squall comes down on the lake. It happens quickly, and the disciples freak out. They think that they're done for. Now, Jesus then rebuked the wind and the raging waters, in verse 24, and the storm subsided and all was calm. The disciples, being Jewish people who knew their Bible and their Old Testament, would not have had a category for a human being who can speak to nature. They had prophets, they had people who could even do fairly miraculous things, a bit of healing here and there, but not somebody who can rebuke nature with their own mouth. They actually believed that the forces, the elemental forces, storms and the weather were controlled by God. And indeed, if a storm came, that it was we still say this for insurance purposes, an act of God. And so they have this sort of conception that it's only God who can actually control or in any way engineer or indeed affect the outcome of the weather. There's nothing we can do. And he gets up and he does it. And rather than the gospel saying, okay, well, this was obvious, they just it leaves us with the narrative, with the disciples asking the question, who is this man? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Because they know only God can do that. And I think the most interesting detail about it that points to the, if you like, the miraculous is he rebuked the raging waters, the storm subsided, and, this is the key, all was calm. Now, how many of you know that if you have been unfortunate to be in a squall at sea, that even if you get through it and the weather changes a bit, that's not the end of it, because then, depending on the wind direction, there's a swell, and that can go on for days. It is phenomenologically, yes, I said that correct, impossible for there to be that kind of a tempest and then the lake to be like a sea of glass immediately after. So he does it to demonstrate the God that you believe in, that has power over the weather, is in your midst. He's got power over nature. And then he's even got power over death. Because you see, the disciples, secondly, think they are going to die. They were in great danger. They said, Master, we're going to drown. So, I mean, this has got to be really bad. If they've been on this sea dozens of times and they genuinely think they're going to die, and other Gospels make that very plain, must have been awful. And Jesus is asleep. Now, in the Old Testament, or indeed in many of the cultures in the Near East, somebody being asleep was often a sign of getting divine favor from God, having rest, especially in the midst of a tempest. It was said that the gods, people around them believed that the gods slept after creating the world because they were taking their rest. Jesus is asleep while this is going on because he knows that it doesn't have the power to swamp them. I think more powerfully than that, they were Jews, his disciples, okay? They were used to the Old Testament stories. That was, if you like, their founding documents as a people, was the Old Testament. And at the very center of that is the Exodus. Now, we all probably did the coloring books in Sunday school of Moses parting the Red Sea and then them crossing it. But it was much more than a Bible story to them. They were like, that was a time when God showed up to dramatically provide a path of life for us when we were going to die at the hands of the Egyptians. They also, in the ancient world, they understood that the sea was a harbinger of chaos, of death even. It was a watery grave is mostly how they saw the sea. And that picture runs all the way through the Bible. From Genesis to Revelation is that the sea kind of represents death. And so in their imagination, in the disciples, by Jesus getting up and stopping this awful tempest, pulling them under, what he was actually communicating to them was, at the center of your imagination is the idea of the sea equaling death. And they thought they were really going to be plunged into it. I even have power over that. Again, they're asking, who is this man? That even the strongest forces, the most deadly evil forces and chaotic forces in the world have to obey him. And they answer that in the next chapter. They say, you're God's anointed, you're God's chosen one. You're the one who God has chosen and sent to deliver us and save us, a bit like Moses in the Old Testament. So if in this story we have Jesus having power over nature and having power over even death, what does that mean for us? What do we do with that? I think firstly, it's to strip it back to basics of what faith, religion, Christianity, believing in Jesus even means or even looks like. Because so often belief, whether through our own lives and added years of tradition or even the hundreds of years in church tradition, our faith can become encumbered with a whole bunch of, if you like, excess baggage, stuff that weighs the ship down, that makes it not feel very nimble, not feel very alive. And at the core of this story is stripping it back to basics. Here is someone who was sent by God. He claimed to be God. We have eyewitness testimony that backs that up, that he did these miraculous things that only God could do. And so what do we do with that? What do we do with that? We might have been estranged from faith and religion. We might have had a terrible experience of faith and religion. There are people everywhere who the church has done a terrible job of guarding their faith and nurturing them in it and helping them through it. And they think that that's Jesus, because they think, well, obviously, they did it in his name. And at the center of this is this call. Who is this man? Because there's every possibility he's not the person that gave you a terrible experience of faith and religion. And if you've grown cold and grown tired and somewhat disdainful of even faith and religion, that's not Jesus. Because he's actually calling people into faith and life, into himself, into someone very powerful, into someone who guards and safeguards the faith of his people. And even disillusionment and confusion can make us not know which way is up. It's like being caught in the middle of a tempest. We can I don't really know what I think about God or faith anymore. And it's to start here, to go, this person made these claims. We have this testimony to it. What do we do with that then? And the other implication for that is that they're with Jesus, the disciples, but it doesn't stop them going through the storm. I think I've said this before, but one of the saddest conversations I have with people pastorally is that I did have faith and I did believe, but something bad happened. There was a tragedy. We lost someone in our family, and that just took away my faith in God. And what really, my heart breaks for them, that they lost faith in those circumstances. But what I'm really annoyed about is that they were given this really anemic picture of God and faith that is no way representative of who Jesus is in the Bible. And I think the church can be guilty of presenting this sort of view of Jesus, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, and he's a really nice guy, and he goes around doing nice things, and church is just completely inoffensive. He lets his disciples nearly die in a storm because he's got a point to make. C.S. Lewis, the writer of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, gets asked about Aslan. Is he safe? And the reply is, no, of course he's not safe, but he's good. You see, there's a difference. And I think people get turned off and fed up of the anemic version of Christianity when there's no reality and there's no meat to it. Jesus doesn't guarantee us we won't go through storms, even if we have the strongest of faith. His own followers got crucified, some of them. But he gives you something much better. Because here's the reality. None of us can avoid the really rubbish stuff in life. None of us can avoid bereavement. None of us can avoid our own death. None of us can avoid or outrun illness forever or tragedy. And none of us want that. But where do you go and what resources do you have when it happens? Because if you know that you can't avoid it anyway, and I'm sorry if you've ever been promised that faith would mean you could avoid those things, wouldn't it be better to have Jesus in the boat with you? That's the way to reframe it and look at it, is to take the honest presentation that we have in the scriptures and to go, well, you know what? If I have to go through suffering and difficulty in this life anyway, and everybody does, I wonder what difference it could make with Jesus in the stern. I wonder what a difference it could make to have him to be available to call on. And when I'm actually in a relationship and he answers me when I call on him. And maybe he doesn't take away the storm. Maybe for you, whatever you're going through, he's not going to snap. And make the difficult thing go away immediately. And we don't always know why we're allowed to go through these storms. But my goodness, the difference it makes when you know he's going through it with you, because he promises to. And that's lastly, I think, the last and most comforting application from this. Because we are left with the challenge of, if this really happened and Jesus is who he said he was, I've got to make a decision. Is he God or not? And is he going to be God in my life or not? Because that's what he wants. You see, for every single one of us, this is why we're here. This is why the church exists. It's because Jesus is still alive today and calling people, and he wants to be in the boat with them. Okay, he wants to make that difference in our lives. And whatever you're going through just now, or wherever you find yourself in life, maybe that is him today knocking. For you, rather than continually trying to calm the storm yourself, using your own resources, is to actually be brought to that place, like I described at the start, when you're in the middle of a squall and you know that you're small and insignificant. You can't sort it out yourself. You can't make a storm go away. Whatever that storm is in your life, maybe the challenge is to ask Jesus to allow him to start to make the difference and to see what the journey, the passage of life could look like with faith in him through every storm. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.